Professor Anita Heiss is an award-winning Indigenous Australian author who practices what she calls creative disruption.
A third of the overall Indigenous population in Australia lives in urban centres. And one of the reasons I write those urban stories is because if you only watched mainstream television and mainstream newspapers, you quite possibly would not understand that or would not know that.
Her stories range from Koori chicklit to children's books. But what's her own story? In this edition of Conversations, Professor Heiss reveals her passions and motivations to the former BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University and Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, Pookong Kee. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this interview was conducted and advises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that this video contains images and names of people who have died.
Anita, welcome.
Mandangu, that's thank you in my language. Would you mind, it's probably off script, if I actually acknowledge country here in my language, is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, so I would like to say Yiridimarang, Yuandu Anita Heiss Baladu Wiradjuri Gilang, Arambichibu Brungley Mir Gandhi Bala Williams, Yinimaladu Wiradjuri, Bulga Galangbu Balagi Bangbu Balambambu Bo Nurambangbu, Yinjimaradu, Yagarabu, Turbo Bull, Mianjin Bull, Maine. And what I said was, I said Yiridimarang, which is literally good day, so good day. My name is Anita Heiss and I have Wiradjuri belonging from Arambi and Brungle missions. And for your students, that's in central New South Wales. I said I'm a Williams and that's my family name. I honoured my Wiradjuri elders, my old people, my ancestors and country, and Wiradjuri country is central New South Wales also. And I paid respect to the traditional owners of country here, where I'm sitting in my office at the University of Queensland, and that's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of Mianjin, which is the traditional name for the city of Brisbane.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you.
Anita, you have been described as an author, an academic, activist, and ambassador for Aboriginal literacy. But how would you describe yourself?
Well, I'm all of those things. I guess I would say I'm a sovereign Wiradjuri Yina, that's a sovereign Wiradjuri woman. But yes, I have many hats and many identities outside of being Wiradjuri. So I would say an author and cultural activist, creative disruptor is what I like, defining myself as a creative disruptor, trying to disrupt the status quo through Australian literature in a creative way.
Well, it's a very, very rich and challenging life, juggling all those important roles that you play. You are one of Australia's most successful and prolific authors, having published across genres, including non-fiction, historical fiction, commercial fiction, poetry, and children's novels. What motivated you to pursue those writing aims?
It's a good question because there's a few genres there. I think the motivation for me is finding the right genre to reach a particular audience. So my historical fiction speaks to a lot of more male writers, for example, than my commercial women's fiction. And I got into commercial women's fiction, which is probably my most successful area, because I was motivated by the opportunity to reach Australian women in particular, reading in book clubs or reading on the bus or at the beach, who read in a particular genre, which is chick lit or romance, but may never have read a book by an Aboriginal author before, may have seen us Aboriginal women on TV, may have worked with us, but never really engaged with our lives. And so I was motivated by this idea of connecting with other women, women around the world, because my work's being published around the world, connecting with them on the things that make us the same as women, human emotions and our experiences with our girlfriends and our sisters and so forth. And then being able to talk about the things that I think all women should be talking about, particularly in Australia. So apart from shopping and and sex and education, but, social justice, Black Lives Matter, Aboriginal deaths in custody, land rights, sovereignty, and so forth. So it's about finding the right genre to reach a particular audience. And I'm motivated to write children's books or novels for upper primary because I want all Australian children to have diversity in their classroom. I want Indigenous kids to be able to see themselves on the page and their life experiences, whether it's playing football or going to the movies or whatever it is. But I want all Australian kids in the classroom to have diversity, which means as an author, I have the responsibility to, create some of those stories.
I'm especially interested in what you have been described by the mainstream media as the Koori chick lit promoter, and your novels such as Titus, they were hugely popular when they came out. And in many ways, they differ significantly from the traditional chick lit with our protagonists who are focused mostly on women's life, sex, and the urban landscape. You chose instead to focus on urban Aboriginal female experiences. As a Wiradjuri woman who grew up in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, how did your personal experiences inform those novels?
Another great question, thank you. And for people who may not know the word Koori is a word we use in much of New South Wales instead of using the word Indigenous or Aboriginal, which are Latin terms for who we are, and most state and territories have our own regional terms. So, Koori Chicklet, it was Chicklet with, Aboriginal Koori lead characters, as you've mentioned, Professor. Obviously, a lot of my own urban life experience informed those characters, and I wrote the first book, Not Meeting Mr. Right, because I was, living near Coogee Beach, where the character lives in that novel, and I was lying down the beach and I was reading fantastic Australian literature by some of my most favourite Australian authors, but I never saw women like me. I never saw Aboriginal women who went to university, who had careers, some who wanted to have children, some who didn't want to have children, who participated in Aboriginal community events and responsibility as well. I never saw women like me on the page, and that's why I originally wrote in that space, but also then to say to Australian readers that I am like you as a woman, but this is also what my life looks like. There are added challenges by being particularly an educated Aboriginal woman, but also the responsibilities that I have to community. So I think that first novel, the main character, Alice Agner, she is a teacher at a private school in the eastern suburbs. I went to a private school in the eastern suburbs. She has an Austrian father, an Aboriginal mother, which was obviously my background as well, although it's not autobiographical. My experiences of growing up as an urban Aboriginal person obviously and continue to impact the stories that I tell or inform the stories that I tell. And for your students, you might not know that a third of the overall Indigenous population in Australia lives in urban centres. And one of the reasons I write those urban stories is because if you only watched mainstream television and mainstream newspapers, you quite possibly would not understand that or would not know that.
Thank you. Your 2001 book, Who Am I? The Diary of Mary Talents, was translated into Chinese by the very eminent translator, Professor Li Yao. And it had a foreword by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. The book is credited with giving Chinese readers a better understanding of the stolen generations. Can you tell us about the translation project and how the book has created the interest on Indigenous Australians in China?
Well, I wanted to show you, in case you hadn't seen the actual, and for your students, the actual Chinese translated edition. And Professor Li Yao, who I met at a dinner party in Melbourne, he did a lot of translation work with Alex Miller, who is an amazing, multi-award-winning Australian literary author. And Alex spoke very, very highly of the professor. And I think we both formed a mutual admiration for the work that we do in our individual countries. And he asked if he could do the translation for Who Am I? The Diary of Mary Talents. And of course, I was very honoured. So I trusted him. Obviously, I don't speak, Mandarin or Cantonese or any other language. So I trusted his work based on what I knew that he'd done for Alex and other Australian authors. And I think what it's done is, it's opened up a new understanding of part of the history of Australia to Chinese readers. And also, I've toured. I was in Shanghai in 2008, I believe, for a literary conference. And I wanted to tell you, I was so surprised, pleasantly surprised by student reactions to many of the conversations I'd have on that tour. The numbers of students that turned up on weekends to participate. And what I learned was, I was quite surprised. I don't know that we could attract that number of students in an Australian university on a Saturday morning, but they were very keen to listen to stories about Australia in English, but then equally keen to ask their questions and practice their English as well, because many students were studying education. And so I think my personal reaction to that was I was very grateful, because we both know that stories are a way of connecting each other as humans. And what I want to do with these books is bring nations and communities and people together and build bridges.
Certainly, we are fortunate in that a number of the writings of our Indigenous writers have been translated into Chinese, and so it's a very direct way for Chinese students and academics to keep up to date with thinking and other views about contemporary Australian society. Anita, there's a long history of interest in Australia's Indigenous communities in China. Even as way back as in the early 1970s, rights campaigners from Australia visited China, and they were welcomed by the Chinese long before China had its open door policy. And the late Aboriginal writer, educator, and activist, one of your role models, Ujaru Ninanga, also known as Kate Walker, she had a strong affection for modern China, as reflected in her collection of her poems, Kate Walker in China, published in 1988. What is your take on such ties between China and Indigenous Australia?
When I think about Ujaru's time in China and I think about her work as an activist, I'm fairly sure the interest between both countries, it comes from or stems from the way in which both nations and countries have been impacted by colonisation and the British influence and level of superiority and the lack of sovereignty that we've both nations have felt through British colonisation. So I have no doubt that that is a connector for us. And of course, in 2018, we acknowledged 200 years of a relationship between China and Australia, because that's when the Chinese first started coming to Australia and migrating to Australia. And of course, in the mid-1850s, we had many tens of thousands of Chinese people coming to the gold fields for the gold rushes. But of course, in the early 19th century, in 1901, I think we had the Immigration Act, which was really about, leading to the White Australia policy and keeping Australia as British. So we had that. We had Chinese people being Chinese migrants being impacted by the White Australia policy at the same time that Aboriginal people in this country were being impacted by legislation as well in terms of acts of protection. And in the 1930s, the assimilation policy, and both of those, the White Australia policy, the assimilation policy, was really about keeping Australia white and making Australia white. So I think and I feel that the acknowledgement and the connection there is this understanding that we were both nations treated as inferior by the British Crown.
And there's, of course, the very interesting and significant relationship or shared, heritage of Indigenous Australians are marrying Chinese gold miners. And among their descendants are some very distinguished Australians who contributed importantly to politics, to literature, and to other aspects of our public life.
Yeah, that's correct. That was the first thing I meant to say, is that we have this long history of intermarriage between the Chinese and Indigenous Australians. And off the top of my head, I can't remember. I know there's been a couple of artists that have done some political work around that as well, and the way in which they identify themselves. And let's hope that continues into the future.
Yes, definitely. Your 2012 memoir, Am I Black Enough for You?, challenge stereotypes around what it means to be Aboriginal in Australia. You famously describe yourself as a concrete Koori with a Westfield dreaming, someone who hates camping and loves shopping. 10 years on, you have updated Am I Black Enough for You? Do you think much has changed in the last decade on the media representation of Indigenous Australians?
I think part of the Am I Black Enough for You in 2012 was around a court case that I was in against Andrew Bolt, who is a newspaper columnist here in Australia. And that court case was around his representations, or I should say misrepresentations and untruths in the media. And I think what happened at that time, which is included in Am I Black Enough for You, was it put the Australian media on notice that you cannot persecute Aboriginal people or any other group in society through your platform, and that it's illegal to incite racial hatred and so forth under the Race Discrimination Act. I think it made journalists, I'm not going to say it made the media understand. I think it made some media understand, but it made many of media professionals nervous about what they could and could not write under the law. And I think that's not a bad thing. If they couldn't figure it out themselves without having to use the law, then I think if we need to use the law to make people write with responsibility, then that's what we have to do. I think what we've seen in recent years, we had in 2018 the release of the anthology Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia through Black Ink Press, with 52 individual stories in there. And I think what that anthology did was make it perfectly clear that if there's going to be a public conversation, and by public conversation I mean played out in the media, there's going to be a public conversation around Aboriginal identity in this country, then it will be driven by First Nations peoples. And so I think there has been a shift. I think there's been much more work, much more literature across genres in children's books, YA, theatre and so forth, where the unpacking of the complexity of identity into a simplified understanding for audiences has occurred. So I think the media is a little bit more savvy. I think they understand now that notions of identity are to be owned by those who are declaring whatever their identity is, not just in terms of race, but obviously in terms of sexual identity as well. I think there's room to grow and so forth. If we particularly look at some of the negative representations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the media, we will see that still the media does portray us from a deficit position constantly. And here I am at a university, and we've been talking about, we've mentioned some Indigenous authors. In my space and in my world, in my family, in my peers, we are functioning from positions of excellence every day. And I think that's where the media plays a huge role in influencing their audiences and how Australians view Indigenous people today.
In part 2 of our interview with Professor Anita Heiss, she explains how historical fiction can be used as a means of truth-telling.